Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Rooney, President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and we want to welcome everyone to today's event. We all know that as a region and a country, we're facing a significant amount of change and uncertainty and trying to create that path forward for us all as we all continue to manage through what has become a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and now a societal crisis. At the Chamber, we remain committed to serving as the voice of the business community, serving as a source of information, and serving as a convener, a place where even virtually people can come together to listen to each other and to learn from each other on topics and issues that are foremost in our mind as we deal with this uncertain time. And today's topic is one of those issues. Early education and childcare is certainly on the minds of all of us in the business community as we think about the ways to welcome back employees, deal with embrace the issues that they are dealing with in planning their return. I want to take a moment to thank those of you that are joining us for the first time. I encourage everybody to ask questions during the program using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And I want to let you know that this program is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Chamber's YouTube page after the presentation. With that, I'd like to give a big thank you to our sponsors today for making this program possible, MFS Investments and PNC Bank. Today's program is a part of our Future of Boston series and is really made possible through the generosity of these two chamber members and engaged organizations. I'm going to turn it over in just a moment to Colleen Richards-Powell, the Vice President of Corporate Citizenship and Diversity at MFS, to introduce today's speakers. But I can't let Colleen have all of the honor of introducing Sandy Fenwick, the President of Boston Children's Hospital. Sandy, each and every time I get a chance to interact and be part of an introduction, I want to let you know it's an honor to be in that position. So with that, I'll turn it over to Colleen Richards-Powell.
Hello, thank you so much, Jim. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. And on behalf of MFS Investment Management, we have invested in early childhood education because we're long-term investors and we understand the importance of that to fueling our future. So I want to thank the panelists here and I want to thank the attendees for your attention to this matter. And it is especially critical as we think about the situation we're in now. I have to say that I'm awed to be in the presence of people who work in healthcare and in human services, places that have been stressed out with our current COVID situation, just managing and being on the front lines of those situations. So I just want to acknowledge you. Thank you for the work that you're doing every day. Healthcare workers, first responders, all of those essential workers that we rely on. I just thank you because I know it's an extreme sacrifice even for you to be here today. So thank you. So I want to introduce today's panelists. First, we have Dr. Shari Nethersall, Executive Director of Community Health at the Boston Children's Hospital. Dr. Nethersall and her team are responsible for driving Boston Children's community mission to improve the health and well-being of children and families in the local community. Next, we have Dr. Shella Dennery, the Director of the Neighborhood Partnership Program at Boston Children's Hospital. In addition to working with students and their families at 16 Boston public schools, Dr. Dennery's program provides professional development and consultation to educators, school administrators, and school staff. Up next, we have Sharon Scott Chandler, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at ABCD. For 21 years, she has held various leadership roles at ABCD, which is a multi-service community action agency that provides early childhood education services to more than 2,300 children in the greater Boston area. Our next panelist is Dr. Mary Jane O'Brien, Boston Region School Nurse Consultant for the Boston Public Schools. Having worked in Boston Public Schools for 30 years, Dr. O'Brien provides a link between the Massachusetts Department of Public Health and public, private, and charter schools in the greater Boston area. Last but certainly not least, we have the legendary Sandy Fenwick, who is the CEO of Boston Children's Hospital and our moderator for today's discussion. Sandy humbly leads a team of 20,000 people. I would say they are an army of improving and advancing child health through their life-changing work. Just this week, Boston Children's Hospital was again ranked #1 in the nation by U.S. News and World Report for the 7th year in a row. Congratulations, Sandy, for your leadership, and to the team at Boston Children's Hospital. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. Sandy, now I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you for your wonderful sponsorship and all the work that you're doing too. And thank you, Jim, for hosting us today. It's really an honor to have this incredible panel to talk about a topic that's near and dear to all of our hearts, whether you're a business or you're a family or a parent. I just wanted to say a few words before we get into asking our esteemed panel to weigh in on these topics. You know, COVID obviously has truly been an unprecedented issue and has impacted all of our lives, short term and likely to be here for a while. And while COVID has spared children to some extent, they're testing positive at only a rate of 2%. And the good news is only about 1% or less have really required real critical care. And we still don't know why. There's still so many unanswered questions about why this has not hit children the way even flu does, and why we have this new syndrome that's now emerging 3 and 4 weeks later. So there's a lot of questions out there and a lot of work to be done. But what we do know is that in the name of safety, in the name of containment of the disease, we all had to respond. Every one of us. Hospitals, obviously even the adult hospitals even more so, in taking care of the patients. But also all of our businesses and also schools, childcare centers, sports, everything related to children. And so that's really today what we really wanted to put some thoughts around and perspectives. The impact of all of this on children, the reopening, what it will look like, what needs to be considered. And what's been wonderful during this whole time period are the partnerships that have only been enriched across so many of our sectors. And I think today is a good example of that, because while we have 2 members of Boston Children's Hospital here, we also have representatives from ABCD for early childhood, and of course from the Boston Public Schools, from the whole health and wellness and well-being sector. And so these partnerships are really the way we need to think about how we are going to respond, how we're going to work together, not only during this time period, but also going forward. So thank you all for joining in. We're going to start where I will ask each of the panelists one question and ask them to just give a sort of a brief high-level answer. And then I'll go into more of a topic selection and ask each of our panelists to give sort of their perspectives on some of these issues that relate to both early education and actually schools. So let me start with one question for all of them, and that is, one big question is, what will childcare, what will early education, and what will schools look like, both in the summer, in the fall, and as we move forward? And what do you hope the landscape will look like in the coming months? So maybe I'll start with Dr. Nethersall Sherry, and then maybe each one of you could just take the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. I'd say that while I hope we have a summer of learning is basically what I would say. While a lot's uncertain, I think we're going to learn a lot as we go. The experiences that we had with emergency childcare over the last months gives us some tools that we can use as we move towards reopening. We also need to look at experiences of other countries if they have reopened their schools and their daycare programs, and what the response has been to that, and learn, recognizing the systems are different, but learn from how those operate and what level of intensity we need to provide. So we'll get more data and information over the summer and early fall. So we'll know better how to manage the fall and the winter and how to operate our schools and our childcare programs. Although most importantly, I hope everyone will get their flu shot this fall. I think that will be critical to making sure we don't have a double whammy this coming winter.
Thank you. Mary Jane?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. You asked, what do I hope the landscape will look like? And so I'm hopeful for effective vaccine and treatment, right? But in the meantime, as Dr. Nethersole said, we continue to look at data, emerging data from other countries, as well as our own data here in the state. We look to researchers to develop more information about the effect of COVID-19 on children, early education and school-age children, and what the value is of closing schools, both economically and educationally. So we're going to look closely at all of that. We do have a return to school committee, which is a joint task force of both the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and the Department of Public Health. And they are producing guidelines, which are not yet out. The summer guidance is out. The initial summer guidance is out, but not the final guidance that we need for return to school. So we're hopeful that that will come, and that will be based on many, many inputs from the CDC, from the American Academy of Pediatrics, and we are looking at a shared responsibility for opening schools and re-entry into the early childhood programs. So we continue to analyze the data, and also we plan, unfortunately, for maybe school closures again, we hope not, but we plan for hybrid solutions, educational programming that has not been seen before, very creative solutions that teachers and parents and families are coming up with during this time of school closure. So I'm hopeful, and there are a lot of unknowns, but we're all learning, as Dr. Nethersole said. So thank you.
Thank you. Sharon?
As both Sherry and Mary Jane have said, we're learning as we go. And as we know, the emergency childcare provider system continues to have capacity through June 29th. And after that, programs in the larger system have begun the process of reopening. The State Department of Early Education and Care updated and put out guidelines of what's required and recommended for the new phase. And so over the next couple of weeks, we hope to understand the impact of those requirements on what it looks like in a childcare, early care, and education setting, to finalize those plans and then prepare the workforce to implement them as children transition back. As providers, we're looking to balance the children's social, emotional health and developmental needs with their physical safety, but also along with protecting the health and safety of the workforce. As we know for sure, in the short to medium term, less children will be in the traditional licensed early care and education system for several reasons. That's safety protocols are going to limit classroom sizes, but also over the summer, parents have other plans. Parents are still reluctant. We're all sort of wading our way through this, reluctant to have their children attend large group settings, as well as the changed workforce demand and the environment we're not sure about. People will continue to work remotely. Some have lost jobs. So as has been said, we're all adapting and adjusting as we go. I think it's been a tough time for everyone. And we're looking forward to a time where we can get back to normal, or maybe a new normal once there's vaccines and the like. But we anticipate things will evolve.
Thank you. And Shella?
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here, especially with this esteemed panel of women today. Regarding schools, there's still so much that we don't know about the future and reopening, like everyone has said. And it's an incredible challenge to plan when we're unsure of the roadmap, we're unsure of the path, and we don't know the landscape as it shifts every day. But I just want to say that we know schools are not going anywhere, and they're here for us. They're here for students, they're here for families, and we need them. It may look different, as people have said. It may go beyond the brick and mortar of the building. It may be hybrid models in the fall. but they're still here, and they're a major touch point for children and families. So my hope and wish for this fall is that we really integrate lessons learned over the past 3 months. We hear from students and families and educators about what worked, what didn't, and how we can put that learning into action in the fall. I also think this is a great opportunity to reflect on how we do business, all of us. And I think we can reflect and reimagine. I also think in the education space, it's not okay to just return to normal. We're so fortunate to live in Massachusetts, where we're #1 in many things, like Boston Children's this week, but also we have the #1 education. We are #1 in education for the nation, but this isn't true for all citizens or all students in our Commonwealth. So my wish is for a redesign that really looks at education through an equity lens, and we start to really build on what we can do for all kids and families to enhance that experience in Massachusetts.
Thank you. So let me do a little bit deeper dive. I'm going to start with Dr. Nethersoft. Sherry, you're a pediatrician. And so let me ask you a question about what you think the major health and public health concerns are as it relates to the coronavirus pandemic, both during and more so even after.
Yeah, yes, I think in terms of direct effects on kids, as you mentioned earlier, that has been fortunately pretty minimal in terms of kids under 20. Very few have been affected. Rare hospitalizations. Most of the children who've been hospitalized have underlying medical problems. And even the multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, is very rare. It's a delayed response to infection. It's very rare. So the direct effects have actually been fairly minimal. But I think the indirect effects are significant and are not fully known at this point. In the communities that have been highly affected, children have seen their parents and relatives become ill, have had deaths and other upheaval and disruptions in their family life. I think in terms of some of the needs that children have on a daily basis, we think, #1, about nutrition, and that can go both ways, that there's, for some families, a lack of food, a lack of access to food. For some children, it's too much food. They're not, they're at home, they're not having as much supervision about their eating potentially, and are eating too much of the wrong kinds of food. I think there are concerns about physical activity. We know that obesity is a significant, childhood obesity is a significant issue. And so, there are a lot of children who spent the last 3 months not being very active. And how is that impacting their health for the long term? And then there are other concerns, obviously, about social isolation, particularly for the adolescents, where so much of their their energy and their well-being comes from their interaction with their peers. So I think we have to really pay attention to that group and how they move forward. And then in general, the mental and emotional health overall. The other thing that I think others have mentioned in the news is that there have been interruptions in care, so there are not as many eyes on children. So we don't really know how they're doing. we honestly don't really know how they're doing, where we can see how much they're showing up in our emergency rooms or in DCF reports or in particular challenges, but we honestly don't know, and I think we will need to spend some time trying to understand that better. And then the last thing I'll just mention is that people have talked about immunizations, and that is one place where sort of interruptions in care have had a little bit of an impact. I'm not incredibly worried about that in the sense that I think we will be able to catch up on this over the summer. A lot of families now are coming in. The young children in particular are getting vaccinated. So hopefully we can be caught up on immunizations in the fall. But in the first couple of months, there was concern about children not having access to their immunizations. And as I mentioned, flu vaccine in the fall.
So Sharon, how has early child education programs how are they going to be dealing with some of these social emotional impacts from COVID in the childcare centers and early childhood ed programs?
So I think, as Sherry said, the biggest thing that we don't know is how the children are doing. We have tried to keep, and a lot of the providers at ABCD and a lot of the providers have been keeping in constant communication with families, staying connected and trying to support them in these stressful times, you know, whether that is with food distribution and food access, their loss of jobs and employment, which leads to housing instability. And so we've been trying to stay in touch with families around that, but not being able to see them every day and not being able to talk with them. I think that has had a huge impact on their well-being. In addition, as I mentioned before, the workforce often mirrors our families that we serve in terms of demographics. They're overwhelmingly female, of color, the low wage nature of early care and education systems. So they too are struggling with the burdens of high cost of living, with the health effects of the pandemic, and lack of access to a lot of opportunities. So we are trying to stay in constant communication with our families and really hope that when they come back, the children, it's their favorite place to be. And although it will be a little bit different, they'll be with their friends, they'll be with positive adults that they love, and we're hoping that will have a greater impact on their social emotional well-being.
Thanks, Sharon. Shella, your program, the Neighborhood Partnership Program, is part of the Department of Psychiatry, and much of what you have been doing is providing a range of services and supports to students and families in the schools, social, emotional, behavioral. What impacts are you seeing among youth, and what are you, what tools or advice are you giving to families during this time?
Sure. So I love what the last two panelists just said. Like, there's so much we don't know about how kids are doing, but we do know that, you know, everyone is responding differently. And we know it can change hour to hour and day to day. But I do think we need to remember that we're in a crisis and that we're all in this together, and not to take that lightly. I've heard people say they don't want to complain, that they don't want to talk about their stress because we're all under stress. But I think it's important that we don't discount that as a start, and that we really don't minimize the impact of this experience on our bodies and our minds. But we know, as Sharon just said, some families are doing better than others. We think a lot about the impact of a lack of resources, poverty, food and job insecurity, and how that all impacts the family, but how it also impacts their mental and behavioral health. So, you know, we are making some assumptions that kids are going to come back with some anxiety, and likely some separation anxiety from their families and being so close for such a long period of time. But we also are sort of thinking about, this is, you know, there's always typical beginning of school year re-entry. So how kids come back to school, we're anticipating that. But we might anticipate some more universal stress just because there's so many unknowns. But I do want to remind all of us how resilient kids are, how strong they are, and that, you know, since we don't know what's happened or what's going to happen when we reopen, it's just really important as adults to remember how kids will take our lead, right? They're listening to us, they're watching how we're reacting to all of this, and they're going to mirror how we respond to this. And so our job is to really guide and lead them, prepping them, scaffolding them, getting them ready to go back. Knowing that we have to tell them it's going to be okay. There may be some unknowns, there may be some challenges, but we are going to get through this together. Just really answering their questions and concerns in advance. And I think having those conversations with your kids are essential, because it's okay. Like, we're facing something that's unknown. And I think that, you know, it's important that we recognize and acknowledge that it's okay to feel anxiety in these moments. As we re-enter. But I do want to call out how much our kids will need our teachers more than ever. And I think the support positions in schools, social workers, school psychologists, school nurses, guidance counselors, how essential they are to the operations of schools. This is really going to require a team effort from the school community. And we know in Massachusetts that some schools don't have these positions. Some schools have part-time positions. And so I really think it's a great opportunity to look at staffing models across the Commonwealth to make sure that kids have the supports they need when they need it. These positions also help build up the teachers and support them as well. Just for example, Boston Public Schools has 70 psychologists for their 125 buildings. So we can do better. That's not quite acceptable. Regarding parents, I would love to talk about that briefly. But I think it's that old airplane example we always talk about, how much in an emergency on a plane we put our own masks on first before we put on our kids' masks. And I know that sounds a little corny to talk about self-care and parenting, but as a parent myself, I know how hard this time has been to sort of juggle all of the things with work and kids and home. But I really think now is the time more than ever for us to take care of ourselves as family members and parents, and we'll be better and more able to be there for our kids, to tap into your support systems. And I think, it's really essential that people know they're not alone in this. We need each other more than ever. And I have so many friends and colleagues saying, but I'm not a teacher. And I'm reminding people that the truth of the matter is we are all teachers, and we all have different things to teach. And how do we lean into that, even as we think about the summer and how we move through the fall? So thanks.
Thank you. Mary Jane, since we're on schools, I know that there have been preliminary reopening guidelines that talk about kids with masks, kids with, distance with their desks, sizes of groups, maybe a combination of remote and in-person learning. Do you think that you all have enough time to get ready for the fall? And how are you thinking about all the things that everybody else has also said?
Yes, it is a very complex problem and challenge to solve and to get ready for September. The initial guidelines that have come out address summer school, and that's limited to less than 25% of the student population. So what's going to happen when we have 100% of students? I just really loved Shella's answer about looking now at different ways of teaching that address inequities and looking to the future for creative solutions. But in the meantime, my experience has been that school communities are resilient and school communities are eager to return to school. And with that sort of spirit, I think that we will be ready in September. Of course, we will follow closely the guidelines from the Joint Committee. We await them eagerly. We know that there's going to be changes. Things like cohorts, for example, where one class stays in that classroom and the teachers move from class to class rather than the students changing classes. Looking at different staggered start times for students. So everything is on the table at this point in time. Everything is being analyzed, and we are hoping for a stronger and better school system. Right now, we are experiencing layoffs. We have had teachers and support staff pink slipped. It's a result of the economy, and even though we knew it was coming, it's devastating when it happens. We are continuing to put forth on the table the importance of having a school nurse in every school building, the importance of having school psychologists, the importance of having support staff. These people make teaching and education programs stronger. So everything is on the table, and I'm very, very confident that come September, we'll open, and we'll open because of the resiliency of the school community.
Well, thank you. There's so many ways we could go on this conversation. Sharon, speaking of the challenges that Mary Jane just talked about in terms of, the economic changes, I'm sure that this has also impacted the early childhood programs and the childcare centers. Are they having to rethink their models, and how are you thinking about all of that? Because obviously, for many of us, we are all depending on our people coming back to work with childcare there and available. So, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. I think, as you said, the field overall operates on close margins, and the crisis has had a devastating financial impact on early childhood education and care and out-of-school time programs. Some of them have been able to take advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program loans offered through the federal COVID support funding, but I have heard that a few may not make it and may not reopen their doors. I think it's important too to point out that there are sort of two distinct elements as part of the system and of an overall 8,000 plus providers. And there are those who, like ABCD, who are in underserved communities and serve the most vulnerable children. Our primary revenue is through subsidies and subsidized childcare. And then there are those who are based on private parent fee-based revenue. And in both instances, providers are compensated based on enrollment. And obviously, since this emergency, there has been no enrollment. So that has really put programs in precarious situations, trying to maintain staff, make sure that staff will be available when we're going to reopen. And the providers who are in underserved communities have been providing that comprehensive child development and early childhood education for the most vulnerable. And we've been able to do so with state support. However, that future, we're sort of grappling what that future looks like when we reopen. But the difference is in the fact that both groups are having a tremendously difficult time. It bolsters the argument that we really have to look at and rethink public funding for early childhood education and universal access to that. So all children have access to high quality education, regardless of where they are, regardless of COVID-19, regardless of anything. We know that childcare is a fundamental infrastructure component for the economy and service to parents who need childcare to go to work. It is just as importantly provides the educational foundation for our youngest children and has proven to make a difference in future access and opportunity and success as children grow up. So we have to really rethink the investments that we make in the early education and out of school time program field. There's been a lot of leadership at the state legislative level, but we really have to garner a larger public will to make sure that people understand that it is a public good. In so many ways, it's just like K through 12. It is a foundation of education that is success, and we need to rethink how we fund it currently.
Thank you. Sherry, you have been doing a lot of work thinking about early 0 to 5, early education, and not only the importance of that on the well-being and development of children, but also how this truly is important to the success of of society and the economy. Could you just comment on that for a minute?
Absolutely. In our community health programs, we've had a focus on 0 to 5 child health and development, and have partnered with and supported several efforts to support access to quality early childhood education, as well as focusing on early childhood development. So the first 3 years are really critical. What we know from the research and from reviewing the literature over many, many decades, that the wiring that happens in your brain in terms of brain growth and development is really crucial in the first 3 to 5 years of life, and that things that can impact that wiring can have long-term effects. So we've talked about adverse childhood experiences, what people call ACEs, and many studies showing that if children have those adverse childhood experiences, it actually affects them for the long term, and those experiences set the stage for life, both in terms of adulthood, both in terms of economic success as well as educational success. Similarly, we know that positive childhood experiences can actually help to mitigate a lot of those adverse childhood experiences. And so that's why it's really critical that we focus on providing quality early childhood opportunities for children, and opportunities where they get to build their skills, have that supported in a healthy, developmentally appropriate way. So that's why I think this is really a critical issue for our society. We always talk about it, prevention. The best prevention that you can do, and the best way to address social determinants of health for the long term, is to actually invest in early childhood. That is the best prevention you can do, both for health and for well-being for adulthood.
And while we're on that, Sharon, I think we know that both history and data have shown that the impact on the, the lower income, underserved communities is really disproportionately hit, in good times to some extent, and even more deeply in bad times. What would you say that either you are doing or we all need to do to think about how those communities really need almost a deeper understanding and a deeper set of commitments?
Yeah, I think I touched on it. You're
Yeah,
absolutely right.
Yeah.
The equity issues have been so highlighted during this time. Whether it's the public health, whether it's the public safety, whether it's the educational and economic opportunities, and those issues absolutely play themselves out in the early care and education field and system, both because the families and children that we serve deserve the same high quality education and care as those with means, but also our workforce. And I keep mentioning, because our workforce is really part of the communities that we talk about who have had disparate impacts on them with all of the issues that we know are. So I think it's really attention, and I love the attention that is being made to this issue right now. These are not new issues, we all know that, but maybe now is the time to make those investments, to make those changes, particularly for my field in early education, but also broader opportunities for low income and communities of color. I think now is the time to make that investment and to really think through the actions that we can take that will make a difference.
So Mary Jane, clearly the same issues apply in the schools. And I guess what are you all doing as administrators, as nurses, as health providers, to assist students and families as they get ready for reopening? And, as we talked about so many of these issues that impact kids getting their health care, as going into childcare, what would you say about how we think about also reentry into the schools?
Well, traditionally, school nurses are the only providers for healthcare, or had been the only providers of healthcare in school. And so now we are seeing different models emerge over the past 15 or 20 years, where we are looking at data, looking at research, and defining the benefit of having school nurse and supports personnel in every school, in every building. But I do want to touch on what Sharon said about this being a time to look at restructuring programs and restructuring schools, and also what Shella said about using this as an opportunity to really emerge with a stronger scholastic model for the future, and looking at funding and what is basic funding. But in the meantime, what school nurses have been doing to make sure that students are ready for reopening. Many school nurses in Boston are involved in many projects, and across the state as well. We had a champion at Weston Public Schools who jumped in and became really the public health champion for that community, and involved the school nurses in contact tracing immediately at the beginning of the COVID outbreak. We saw that all across the state. In Boston, when they asked school nurses to volunteer to be contact tracers, they needed 4, they got 40 applicants. In Boston, we're also seeing school nurses who show up to schools where food is distributed and take boxes of food every day to families of students with special health care needs, in order to have those eyes on those students. They are making countless phone calls to providers and specialists to make sure that the students are safe during this time when they're not physically in the building. So we're seeing a lot of really creative responses from school nurses and school administrators. The virtual health office, making sure that reproductive health needs are being met with a partnership with Boston Public Health Commission, and just establishing just really creative ways of making sure that students and families' needs are being met, from the basic food to telecommunication. So it's an exciting time. We can learn a lot right now.
Given all that we're learning about, you know, what has worked, I know in our world, telehealth has been a tremendous both assistance in helping us reach children, and remote learning has been how we have flipped quickly to trying to keep our educational relationship with our children and our teachers and students together. Shella, you know, you have I think done some thinking and some work about remote learning, and do we have any data at this point? And how do we think about not only what we've learned from the last 15, 16 weeks to how that, and anybody can obviously jump in here, but how do we think that that is going to be both an assist, but also the challenges related to that?
Wow. Well, I think, we have been immersed right into it, and we've learned the strengths and challenges. I think especially working in Boston, you learn really quickly. This is, it's an amazing tool, but it doesn't work for everyone. And so we're also thinking about people who have very crowded homes, no privacy. How do you connect this way? But I do want to pause for a second and just talk about, we've been working really closely with teachers and school leaders during this time. And this is not something they were trained to do. They were not trained to do Google Classrooms or Zoom classrooms. And so we just want to pause and admire the shift that they all took during this time. I think some of the things that we have felt have been powerful. Our team has been able to really join Google Classrooms and do classroom lessons on sleep awareness, screen time, stress. And we've also been having conversations about current events and really helping to think about restorative circles, thinking about fighting for justice and for right, and having conversations about racism and discrimination. And I think really having people be able to join in this space and come together around this important time. So this has not stopped. That's a primary a part of our model. But we've been sort of shifting and thinking about how could we design a summer series of trainings for teachers around social emotional learning and behavioral health and reentry, and sort of help teachers feel prepared in that space. I think they're getting so much around math and reading and sort of curriculum, but how do we also give them the tools and the confidence they need in this space? I just really quickly want to share that I talked to Corey Harris at Boston Public Schools yesterday, and he's the, don't mess up his title, but he is the Chief Accountability Officer for the Boston Public Schools. And he said, the wish list for schools, what they need right now from the business community, from healthcare, they need supports to do school-based pantries. They need tutors and mentors. And I think now's the time we can do this virtually in a new way. They need books for home libraries. They need school supplies, PPE donations. But they're also trying to create community schools and a hub model. And they need, champions to help fund coordinators for schools. So I think that this is a really exciting time to think about how we all can step up, because schools cannot do this alone. And I think also about screening youth and social, emotional, and behavioral health needs. We screen them for math and for reading, but how can we also proactively identify kids who might need more support? We know all kids are going to need some support, but how do we really start to know who might need a little more and provide that in the beginning rather than waiting for a crisis? So,
thank you. Sharon, we're getting some panel questions in. And interestingly enough, Shella, you answered sort of that from, and maybe Mary Jane, you can add to it, but what can the business community do as advocates for change? What can we do as leaders in the community? And what's the call to actions? And maybe you could also talk about some of the very specific things for childcare, because I think everybody's interested in really both, because I'm sure, depending on where your children, your grandchildren, wherever they are, we're interested in how do we help the whole spectrum. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think that the business community, we, as the early childhood field, we really need the business community to come into this discussion and support the need for high quality early education and care. It is, as they know from their perspective, it is a workforce issue for them. It is an infrastructure issue. People, well, we used to think that people could not come to work, to do work without childcare. We know that to be true because there are so many sectors where you cannot work remotely. And so we know that we are vital to the infrastructure of business, but also from, as I said, the educational perspective. I mean, this is the future workforce of the Commonwealth. And we need to invest in them at the earliest time. I think Sherry said it. This is the critical time for their development. And from our perspective, those who have the least, those who have the least access, those who have the least resources need to really be at the top of the priority list in terms of those investments that we make. And so we ask the business community to join us in really fighting for more investment, more attention to what is needed to the infrastructure, to the system that we currently have, and thinking through it with both an equity lens, but also an economic lens, and what is really viable for us to continue programs, for us to serve children in the way that they need to be served.
So I think those are a lot of the questions that are coming in. Clearly, what kind of financial support will be available? Not clear at the moment, right? I know that Representative Clark, Catherine Clark, has filed a 10 billion, I think now. I think she was talking about 50. I think she filed it at 10 billion infrastructure support for early childhood education and child care. Obviously that's going to wind its way. That would be fabulous support, infrastructure support. But it will be a grant, and not everybody's going to be eligible for the grants, and it won't go that far. But I think you're all talking about the same thing. There needs to be a lot more investment, whether it's through public financing, private financing, philanthropy. We need support to this whole area, public, private programs, centers, and obviously our schools. At every level. Sherry?
And I would just add to that, it's just, I think the business community, in terms of using their power and their voice as advocates, is incredibly important for them to advocate for these issues. And as we talk about the resources and support that's needed, recognizing that a lot of that is about the pay that goes to early child care providers. So both the pay that supports what they do, but also supports their education and training, because that's how we build quality child care. So really recognizing that when we talk about resources in the big sense, yes, some of that's about supporting the infrastructure and the supplies and all of that, but a lot of this is, as we talk about investing in our workforce globally, we're also talking about really investing in the workforce in the early child care space.
Absolutely.
Well, and can I add too that in terms of the needs, and the schools know this as well, that the families who are the most vulnerable need more resources. I mean, they have mental health needs that they do not exist in every family, and they need nutrition, as Mary Jane already said. We're feeding children pretty much their only meals sometimes in a day, and so there are supports and additional resources that are needed in more so in some communities than others, and we have to recognize that cost, is something we need to invest in.
There's one last question before I try and start wrapping up, and the question is, what about the differential impact on different populations of children? Particularly as we think about, all the diverse populations that make up our city and also our broader community, African American, immigrant children, Latinx children. We have so many populations, Asian. It's such a wonderful, array of populations. How are we thinking about addressing that? And in fact, that was going to be, and I won't do it now, I was going to just end by talking so much about the importance of equity. Equity in schools, equity in childcare, equity in healthcare. And so maybe we could just open that up, since it's a broader question. I was going to end with a little bit around that, since it's such an important part of our conversations these days. Any of you?
So I can start. I mean, I think that as we've seen, the issues about inequities have fallen on the same populations that have inequities in everything else. So COVID-19 has really been no different. And we know that there are inequities in early childhood education as well as in older school-age children education. And the reason for that has to do with all the other reasons that all the other inputs to why people are protesting now, and it's about economic inequalities, and I think that and the history of racism in our country, and so we have to recognize that this is no different. That this is suffering from the same inequalities, disinvestment, lack of access, and racism. To put the structural and institutional types of racism that that people are protesting about, and we need to just call it what it is and to acknowledge it, and then to be able to take the next step. Well, how are we addressing this? We know that there's a gap it's an achievement gap in schools. We know that kids enter kindergarten with some kids more ready to learn than others, and so that's what early education is really focused on addressing. But we know that there are underlying factors that address communities. So it's not just about investing in individual children or individual child care programs, but it's about how do you think about communities and what they need, and how do you structure systems so that they have the power and resources to address those needs.
Is it okay to add to that a bit? I was just thinking about, families of color and youth of color don't access mental health at the same rates as white families. And so we do spend a lot of time thinking about the medical system, the medical models that we've designed. And I think it is really time to take a hard look at sort of this individual therapy model. There's research that shows youth of color go to 1 or 2 sessions and drop out and don't come back. And so thinking about having culturally responsive services, thinking about group work and different ways to intervene with kids and families. And I think we tend to lean into systems because that's the way it's been done, or this is the way that we've set up this, but I don't really think we need to do that anymore. So really reinventing mental health and what it might look like. And I think schools are such a right place to do that, and to really open up doors to reduce stigma and allow people to access care in new ways that we haven't been able to in the past as well.
Sharon or Mary Jane?
One of the examples that I give when we get on subjects of inequities is that the school nurses at the height of the epidemic went into their offices and got all their PPE and gave it to first responders because they weren't in school. And it just at the time struck me, when we return to school, what's it going to be like for the school nurses then who have no PPE now? And that is just a sort of a lens to look at what's happening with inequities racially and across all systems. The fact that Mayor Walsh has just declared racism a public health crisis is really going to open up the door to conversations that Shella talked about they're having with students in school, and really address it, call it what it is, as Sherry said, and let's start doing something about it. When you don't fund anything to work, then you're not going to get positive results. We need to look at how things have been structured in the past, what worked, what didn't. We have to move forward. This is a whole new beginning, or can be approached as a whole new beginning. I'm eternally optimistic. I see this as a whole new beginning and a whole new way to restructure learning, to restructure, as Shella said, mental health, to restructure daycare. It is an opportunity, and I'm going to continue to view it as that, and I'm going to continue to work towards making that happen.
Thank you, Mary Jane. Sharon?
I think the one thing that I'll add, because a lot has been said about it, is for us, one of our hugest assets is our workforce, because our workforce is diverse and reflects the communities and the children that we serve. At the same time, it's not a coincidence, and Sherry mentioned that they are the lowest paid, one of the lowest paid sort of industries. They are primarily women and primarily of color. And we have to look at that as a structural institutional inequity, racism, whatever we'd like to call it. It is not a coincidence. And so we have to think about the asset that we have, but the investment we are making, or not the lack of investment that we've had in paying people wages that they can sustain and live on, that allow them professional development opportunities and access to college and higher education without going bankrupt, but in most instances they can't afford it at all. So I think those are things that we think about as we're moving forward in trying to do it.
Well, I think are just about out of time. I know that we could have asked many, many, many more questions. And I know there are many more questions out there. I know people are all looking for advice as to how to approach this for themselves, their children, their businesses. These are very trying times. But, you know, I think we look at all of this and the change that has been thrust upon us, but I also look at all the silver lining, and that is how many people are working together and collaborating and reaching out to support each other. And I think this was a great example of just the amazing amount of work that is going on within each of your areas, but also across. And how do we keep that up? How do we sustain those partnerships, those collaborations, to really do this on behalf of our most important asset, and that is our children, because they are 20% of our population, and as I always say, 100% of our future. So let us continue to do what we can. I know there's a lot more that we could talk about today and the advice you could give, but it's still so uncertain, and there's, you know, no rock solid, even in our own healthcare setting. There's not concrete answers that aren't changing daily. So first, let me thank each of you for everything you're doing every day and have been doing for, I could say decades for each of you, and for everything that you're doing for the children. And thank you all for coming in today. Jim had to drop off, so I will just wrap up and do a very quick shout out. Please, if you are able to join our annual meeting of the Chamber on June 29th from 3:30 to 5, you can register on the website. It is going to be a very interesting discussion. And obviously, it is a very important time for us all to continue to be educated about every one of these kinds of issues, whether you come to one of the programs or you come to the annual meeting. We really need to stay together as a community, and obviously as a business community, but also across all of our various supports to that business community and to our kids and our families. So thanks for joining, and I think we're just about out of time. Thank you all.